Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, here to lead you through tonight's chilling journey. If you find these stories help you unwind or gently guide you to sleep, consider supporting the channel by liking this video and subscribing if you haven't already. It truly helps bring more of these stories to you. Also, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and the time where you are. It's always fascinating to connect with listeners around the world. So, take a deep breath, settle in, and prepare yourself for a night of mystery and suspense. It all started on a regular Saturday night. My friends and I have a group chat on WhatsApp where we'd exchange random memes, plan hangouts, and catch up. The group chat, called Night Owls, was like our safe space, and we never added anyone else outside our close circle. But that night, I noticed something strange. When I opened the chat, there was a new member named Unknown. No profile picture, no status, and a number none of us recognized. Figuring it was a glitch, I sent a quick message. "Hey, who added someone new?" But no one responded right away. Just as I was about to ignore it, Unknown sent a message. "I see you all." Chills ran down my spine. It wasn't funny, and none of my friends would have done something like that as a joke. Moments later, my friend Chris replied, "Ha ha ha, very funny. Who's messing with us?" But Unknown didn't respond. The next message Unknown sent was strange. "Remember that night at the lake? The pact you made?" I felt a knot form in my stomach. That was something we never talked about. Years ago, on a camping trip by a lake, my friends and I had made a stupid pact, something we did on a dare to scare ourselves. We'd promised to stay friends forever no matter what, and sealed it by tossing a small stone into the lake for each of us. It was just a silly memory, a secret among friends, and we hadn't told anyone else. "Whoever you are, that's not funny," my friend Maya replied, clearly as unsettled as I was. But Unknown kept typing. "Not funny? You broke your promise." Everyone went silent in the chat. I could feel the tension through my phone screen. After a few seconds, another message popped up from Chris. "Okay, who's pulling this prank? It's not cool." But I could tell by the responses from my friends that none of them had any idea what was going on. Just as I was about to call Chris to figure out who was playing around, Unknown sent an image. It was a photo of us, from that exact night at the lake, sitting around the fire. I felt my hands go cold. The photo was taken from a distance, like someone had been watching us from the shadows. None of us had ever seen that photo before. Everyone in the chat was freaking out. Unknown started typing again. "One by one, you'll remember the promise." Before anyone could respond, Maya texted, "I'm leaving the chat, this is creeping me out." But the strangest thing happened. Just as she was typing that, Unknown replied, "You can't leave. You never really left." And with that, Maya's number vanished from the group. Her icon, her name, gone. I tried calling her right away, but her phone went straight to voicemail. My other friends did the same, but none of us could reach her. It was as if she had just disappeared. The next day, when I tried to go over to her place, her family said she hadn't been home. They'd assumed she was with us. No one knew where she was, and all her belongings were just gone. It was as if she'd never existed. Terrified, I rushed back to the group chat. The others were just as freaked out, and Chris had already tried reporting Unknown to WhatsApp support, but they claimed no user by that number existed. We were trapped in this chat with a stranger, and it felt like we couldn't get out. The messages from Unknown kept coming, each more cryptic than the last. Promises must be kept. Secrets don't stay buried. You're next. One by one, my friends' names started disappearing from the group chat. First Chris, then Ella, then Tom. Each time, the same thing happened. Unknown would say something cryptic like, "See you soon," and they'd vanish from the group and from our lives entirely. I was the last one left, alone in the chat with this nameless, faceless entity. My heart pounded as I typed, "Who are you? What do you want?" There was a long pause before Unknown finally replied, "You broke the pact. You all left, but you didn't keep your word. Now, you'll remember, forever." The screen went dark, and I felt my hands trembling. Then I saw one last message. only this time, it was outside the app. It was on my lock screen, as if the words were written from inside my phone. Your turn. The next day, I woke up in my room, but something felt wrong. My phone was missing, and as I looked around, I noticed things were off. It was like I was still in the same place, yet somehow different. I tried calling my friends from a landline, but none of their numbers existed. I realized then that I had become part of something far darker, trapped in a place where no one remembered me, where I'd become the next unknown, just another name lost in a forgotten group chat, watching and waiting. Working as a pizza delivery driver isn't exactly glamorous, but it's simple enough, and the tips are usually decent. Most nights are routine: pick up the pizzas, drive, drop them off, and repeat. But one night, I received an order that I'll never forget. It was nearing the end of my shift, and I was ready to call it a night when a last-minute delivery request came through. The address was on the outskirts of town, where homes are sparse, surrounded by woods and empty roads. A chill went down my spine as I read it. 124 Willow Road. I'd never been there before, and it seemed like the kind of place that didn't get many visitors. As I pulled up to the house, I felt like I had entered another world. The building was old, covered in ivy and shadows cast by towering trees. Its windows were dark, and the porch light flickered weakly, barely illuminating the door. I tried to shake off the eerie vibe and grabbed the pizza. I knocked, but no one answered. After a few moments, I knocked again, louder this time. Just when I was about to give up, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a narrow slice of darkness inside. A voice, low and raspy, called from within, "Come in." I froze. I was a delivery driver, not a house guest, and something about the voice sent a wave of unease through me. But I had a job to do, so I swallowed my fear and stepped inside. The entryway was dark and musty, smelling faintly of mildew and something else I couldn't place. I could barely see 2 feet in front of me as I walked down a narrow hallway. Shadows loomed along the walls, shifting and stretching in the dim light from my phone. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely a whisper. The voice came again, closer this time. "In here." I walked further in, my steps echoing on the wooden floor. The door at the end of the hall creaked open slightly, revealing a flicker of light. It was an odd, pulsating glow that seemed to move, almost like it was alive. My heart raced as I approached the door, every instinct telling me to turn around and run. But some strange curiosity, kept me moving forward. As I stepped into the room, I saw it was empty, except for a single chair in the center and a dusty mirror propped against the far wall. I placed the pizza on a small table near the chair, looking around, but no one was there. My phone vibrated, startling me. It was a message from an unknown number. "Thank you for the delivery. Now, look in the mirror." I felt my blood turn to ice. My hands shook as I raised my gaze to the mirror. At first, I saw only my own reflection, pale and anxious, eyes darting around. But then, something shifted behind me in the reflection. A dark figure, shadowy and indistinct, stood just over my shoulder, watching me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure had moved closer. Its face was still obscured, but I could see faint outlines of eyes, watching me with a malevolent intensity. My phone buzzed again. "Do not turn around." My breathing quickened, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure in the mirror reached out a hand, stretching toward my shoulder. It felt like it was trying to pull me into the glass itself, to trap me within that dark reflection. Desperate, I tried to move, but it was as if my feet were glued to the floor. The buzzing of my phone continued, relentless, and I finally forced myself to glance down. "Thank you for joining me." The text came with a photo attachment. My stomach dropped when I opened it. It was a picture of me, standing right where I was, in front of the mirror, with the shadowy figure behind me. But in the photo, the figure's face was clear. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine with a sinister smile stretched across its inhuman features. The last message appeared as I stared at the screen, horrified. Welcome to your new home. In that moment, I felt a pull, a dark, unrelenting force dragging me toward the mirror. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My reflection started to fade, replaced by that monstrous figure, grinning with satisfaction. The next morning, a new delivery driver arrived at the house on Willow Road, carrying another pizza. They knocked on the door, waited, and just as I had, decided to step inside. And there I was, waiting, now just another shadow in the mirror, eager to welcome them to the darkness. I was driving through the desert late one night, trying to make it to the next town before morning. I'd been on the road for hours, and the stretch of highway seemed endless, flanked by nothing but miles of open desert under a pitch-black sky. As my eyes grew heavy and the road blurred in front of me, I decided to pull over at a small, run-down motel by the side of the highway. The motel looked abandoned, the neon sign flickering and buzzing faintly. There were only a few cars parked outside, their occupants presumably inside, fast asleep. The check-in office was empty when I walked in, with just a small bell on the counter. I rang it, and after a long wait, an old man shuffled out from the back room. He didn't say much, just handed me a key and gestured to the room at the end of the hall. Room 13. The place was as worn out as you'd expect. The wallpaper was peeling, and a faint musty odor hung in the air. But I was too tired to care. I set my bag down, locked the door, and collapsed onto the bed, hoping to get a few hours of sleep before continuing my journey. As I lay there in the dark, I began to hear faint sounds from outside my door. At first, it was just the occasional creak, like the sound of footsteps passing by. But soon, the noises grew louder, whispers, shuffling, and a soft tapping on the wall. I told myself it was just the old pipes, or maybe another guest. But then, something else happened that made my blood run cold. Someone was watching me. I could feel it. That unmistakable sensation of being observed, like a prickling on the back of my neck. I turned toward the small window facing the parking lot, and that's when I saw it. A figure stood just outside, silhouetted against the dim glow of the flickering sign. They were still, unmoving, but their face was obscured by the shadows. My heart raced as I slowly reached for my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I was cut off, trapped in this decrepit room with only a thin door separating me from the figure outside. Minutes passed, and the figure didn't move, didn't even shift. It was as if they were waiting for something, or someone. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they were gone. I exhaled, thinking maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just the exhaustion playing tricks on me. But then there was a knock at my door. A cold, deliberate knock. I froze, my hand halfway to the door, unsure of what to do. Another knock came, louder this time, insistent. I finally gathered the courage to speak. Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep the fear from my voice. No response. Another knock, harder and louder, rattling the door. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the doorknob, waiting for it to turn. But it didn't. The knocking continued, relentless, echoing through the tiny room. And then, silence. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Finally, I heard footsteps retreating down the hallway, slow and heavy, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the door until the first rays of dawn crept through the window. As soon as the sun was up, I grabbed my bag, rushed out of the room, and left the key on the counter in the empty office. I practically ran to my car and sped out of the parking lot, not looking back. Later that day, I stopped at a diner in the next town and told the waitress about my strange experience. She listened with a knowing expression, then leaned in close. "That motel? They say it's haunted. People who stay in room 13 often see a visitor, someone who never quite left." I laughed it off, but a chill ran down my spine. When I glanced in my rearview mirror before leaving, for just a split second, I thought I saw that same figure standing by the roadside, watching me drive away. It all started when I found an old Polaroid camera at a flea market. I didn't need it, but it had this vintage charm I couldn't resist. When I got home, I realized there was still some film inside, so I decided to test it. I took a few pictures of my apartment, my bookshelf, my desk, even the corner where my cat liked to nap. The photos came out grainy and dark, but they had a certain eerie beauty. That night, I developed the photos on my desk. As I flipped through them, one of them caught my attention. It was a picture of my living room, but something was off. In the far corner, near the window, there was a dark silhouette. It looked like a person, tall, thin, with no distinct features. Just a shadow. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no way someone had been in my apartment. I lived alone, and I hadn't seen anyone when I took the picture. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, I thought, and tried to shrug it off. But then, each time I took another picture, that shadowy figure appeared again. In my kitchen, standing near the doorway. In my bedroom, standing at the foot of my bed. Even in the bathroom mirror, watching me. Each time, the figure seemed a little closer, a little clearer. After a few days, I was officially freaked out. I stopped taking pictures, hoping that would be the end of it. But the following morning, I found another Polaroid on my desk. It wasn't one I had taken. This one was different. It showed me, asleep in bed, with the figure standing beside me, watching. I couldn't sleep that night. Every sound, every shadow in my apartment felt like a threat. I considered throwing the camera away, but something told me it wouldn't matter. This presence, whatever it was, had already attached itself to me. The next day, I received another photo, slipped under my door. This one showed me in my living room, looking terrified, clutching the Polaroids. The figure was still there, closer than ever. Desperate, I decided to destroy the photos. I gathered them all, took them outside, and set them on fire, hoping this would somehow break the connection. As I watched the flames consume the images, I felt a small glimmer of relief, like maybe this was finally over. But when I went back to my apartment, a new photo was lying on my bed. It showed me outside, burning the pictures, with the shadow standing just behind me, closer than it had ever been before. That was when I realized it wasn't just in the photos anymore. I've always loved old libraries, so when I moved to a new town and found one just a few blocks from my apartment, I was thrilled. It was a small building made of weathered bricks with ivy creeping up the walls, like something out of another time. The sign above the door simply read, "The Archive." One evening after a long day at work, I decided to stop by. When I stepped inside, the smell of aged paper and leather filled the air. The place was almost empty, save for an elderly woman at the front desk, who looked up at me and gave a slight knowing nod. She didn't say a word, just gestured toward the rows of shelves behind her. The library was larger than it looked from the outside, with shelves reaching high above, stacked with books of all shapes and sizes. The deeper I went, the quieter it got, as though the walls themselves were swallowing up any sound. The lights were dim, casting strange shadows that danced along the aisles. As I wandered, I noticed something peculiar. Each row had a small handwritten sign on the end, noting different sections. Some were expected, like history or science, but others were odd, like forgotten memories, unfinished stories, and lost secrets. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to explore. At the end of one row, labeled Echoes, a single book caught my eye. It was an old, faded, leather-bound journal with no title on the cover. When I opened it, my heart nearly stopped. Inside were handwritten pages, stories, memories, events. And as I skimmed through, I realized I knew these stories. They were mine. The first entry was from when I was a child, about a night when I'd been lost in the woods behind my grandmother's house. No one else had known what happened that night. I'd never told anyone. But the story was there, written as if the person who'd authored it had been watching me. I quickly closed the journal, a chill running down my spine. I decided to put it back, but as I turned to leave, I noticed another book on the shelf next to it. This one had my name on the spine. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to leave, but I picked it up and opened it. The pages were blank, except for the first one. Written in neat handwriting were the words, "Write your story, or it will be written for you." As I read, I felt the temperature drop. Shadows lengthened around me, and the faint sound of whispers echoed through the aisles. I tried to pull myself away, but something in the air held me still, an invisible force compelling me to stay. I glanced back at the journal with my name on it. I didn't remember writing any of those entries, but the more I read, the more familiar they felt, like memories I'd forgotten or abandoned. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the eerie silence. It was a text from an unknown number. "Finish it." The message was accompanied by a photo, an image of me standing in the library, holding the book. But what made my blood run cold was that the image showed someone standing behind me, shrouded in shadow. Their hand rested on my shoulder. In a panic I turned, but no one was there. Just rows upon rows of books, stretching endlessly into darkness. Another message appeared on my phone. "Read it. All of it." With trembling hands, I opened the book to the next page. To my horror, new lines had appeared, describing exactly what I was doing in that moment, standing in the dim light, feeling my pulse race, glancing over my shoulder. Desperate to break free, I dropped the book and ran toward the exit, but the rows of shelves seemed to shift around me, the aisles bending and stretching like a maze. Every turn brought me back to the same place, the aisle labeled Echoes, with that cursed journal lying open on the floor. Realizing there was no escape, I bent down and picked up the book. The final page was blank except for one line: "Finish the story, or stay here forever." With no other choice, I began to write. Each line felt like it drained something out of me, as if the words were anchoring me deeper into the library's shadows. My memories blurred, and my hands felt numb, but I kept writing, unable to stop. Page after page, I filled the book until I reached the end. As I closed the book, a strange calm settled over me, but I knew something had changed. I was no longer myself. The library had taken something from me, a piece of my soul, perhaps. I walked back to the front desk where the elderly woman watched me with a faint smile. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked, her voice soft but knowing. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the book still in my hands. When I looked down, I saw my own name written on the spine, clearer than before. I placed it on the desk and, without another word, left the library. The door closed behind me, but as I stepped outside, something felt wrong. The town around me seemed unfamiliar, as if I had stepped into a different version of my own world. I looked at my reflection in a nearby window, and a stranger's face stared back. Now, I understand the curse of the archive. I was no longer the writer of my story. I was a part of it, just another forgotten memory, waiting on the shelf for the next visitor to stumble upon my tale. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway. My friends and I had spent weeks planning a camping trip up in the mountains, far away from the noise and distractions of the city. We all needed a break. Work, school, and life had been exhausting lately, and the thought of a peaceful weekend surrounded by nature was exactly what we needed. We packed our tents, sleeping bags, and enough food for 3 days. The drive was long, winding up narrow mountain roads, but the view was breathtaking. By the time we arrived at the campsite, the sun was already starting to set, casting an orange glow over the trees and the lake nearby. We found a perfect spot at the edge of the campground, nestled between tall pines with a clear view of the lake. There were a few other campers around, but the area was mostly quiet. After setting up our tents and building a campfire, we settled in for a night of stories and laughter under the stars. As night fell, the woods around us took on an eerie stillness. The usual sounds of chirping insects and rustling leaves seemed muffled, almost as if the forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, fueled by the darkness and the faint glow of the campfire. We took turns telling scary stories, each one trying to outdo the last. By the time it was my turn, the fire was dying down, casting long shadows across our faces. I started to tell a story about a mysterious figure that haunted campers in the woods, and as I spoke, I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. There, just beyond the firelight, was a figure standing between the trees. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could see the outline of a person, watching us. My heart skipped a beat, and I nudged my friend next to me, pointing in the direction of the figure. But when I looked back, it was gone. "Did you see that?" I whispered, trying not to alarm the others. My friend shook his head, giving me a puzzled look. "See what?" I scanned the tree line again, but there was nothing there. Maybe I had imagined it, I thought, or maybe it was just a shadow cast by the fire. I forced myself to laugh it off, and we continued with our stories, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Later that night, we crawled into our tents, exhausted from the long day. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest, trying to fall asleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I thought about that figure in the woods. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew something was off. Sometime around midnight, I was jolted awake by a strange sound. It was a soft whispering, barely audible, like someone speaking just outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to hear. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but I couldn't make out any words. It was like someone was speaking in a language I didn't understand. I sat up, my heart pounding, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow over the campsite. And then I saw it again, the figure standing at the edge of the campsite, just beyond the dying light of the fire. This time I could see it more clearly. It was a tall, thin figure, dressed in dark, tattered clothing. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel its gaze on me, piercing and cold. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. I slowly reached over and shook my friend awake, whispering for him to look outside. He groggily sat up and peered out of the tent. His face went pale when he saw the figure. What is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, the figure took a step forward, moving closer to the tent. I could see it more clearly now. Its face was pale, almost skeletal, with hollow, dark eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Its mouth was twisted into a crooked smile, like it was amused by our fear. We scrambled out of the tent, our hearts racing, and woke up the others. Everyone was panicked, staring at the figure that now stood at the center of our campsite. It didn't react to our presence, didn't seem to care that we were watching it. It just stood there, smiling that twisted smile. One of my friends, in a moment of bravery, or maybe desperation, grabbed a flashlight and shone it directly at the figure. But as soon as the light hit it, it vanished, disappearing into the shadows as if it had never been there. We spent the rest of the night huddled together by the fire, too afraid to go back to sleep. Every rustle, every crack of a branch made us jump, expecting to see the figure return. But the rest of the night passed without incident. As soon as the sun rose, we packed up our things and left, not saying a word about what had happened. The drive back to the city was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we had seen. A few days later, one of my friends called me, sounding shaken. He said he had been looking through the photos from our trip, and in one of them, he had captured the figure, standing in the shadows just beyond the firelight, watching us with that same twisted smile. None of us could explain what we saw that night, but we all agreed on one thing. We would never go back to that campsite. And even now, every time I close my eyes, I can still see that figure, standing just beyond the edge of the firelight, waiting. When I was a college student, I worked part-time at the old city library to make ends meet. I loved the place with its towering shelves and the smell of old paper. It was a quiet job, perfect for studying and catching up on my assignments during late-night shifts. Most of the other employees were much older, and by closing time, it was just me and the night janitor, Greg. The library had been built in the early 1900s, with Gothic architecture, stone gargoyles outside, and winding staircases inside. And though it was beautiful, it also had a bit of a reputation. There were rumors, passed down from one employee to another, about strange things happening at night. Some people claimed to have seen figures moving between the shelves or hearing whispers when they were alone. I always brushed it off, thinking it was just the creaks and groans of an old building. But one night, I'd realize how wrong I was. It was winter, and the library was closing early due to an incoming snowstorm. I had just finished stacking books on the top floor near the history section when I noticed something strange. One of the shelves seemed to be pulled slightly away from the wall, as if it had been moved recently. Curious, I tried to push it back, but it wouldn't budge. I leaned closer and noticed a faint draft coming from behind it. My fingers found a narrow gap on the edge, and before I realized what I was doing, I pulled the shelf a little more. It swung open like a door, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. I'd worked in that library for almost a year and had never seen anything about a hidden staircase. My heart pounded as I stared down the steps, a sense of unease growing inside me. But being the curious person I am, I couldn't resist. I turned on my phone's flashlight and began to descend. The stairs were steep and creaky, winding down further than I'd expected. The air grew colder and a musty smell filled my nose. At the bottom, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. Dust coated everything, and old books lay scattered across a long, dark wooden table. But there was something else that immediately caught my attention: paintings. Dozens of portraits hung on the walls, each depicting a serious-looking man or woman from a different era, dressed in dark, old-fashioned clothing. Their eyes seemed to follow me, their expressions cold and unsettling. I felt a chill run down my spine as I glanced around the room. Something about those paintings didn't feel right. Then, as I took a closer look, I noticed something strange. In the corner of each painting was a small plaque with a name and a date, usually a birth and death year. The dates spanned decades, centuries even. But the last painting, which was covered in a thick layer of dust, had only a birth year, with no death year. My heart skipped a beat as I read the name. It was my name. I stared at it in shock, not understanding what I was seeing. How could my name be here? How could a portrait of someone who looked like me have been painted decades ago? My mind raced as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the chair. And then I heard it, a faint whisper. The sound was so soft that at first I thought it was just my imagination. But as I stood there, frozen, the whisper grew louder, more distinct, and I could make out words. "Come closer." My legs felt like lead, and every instinct in me screamed to run. But something held me in place, like an invisible force was keeping me there. The whisper continued, low and insistent, calling my name over and over. A shadow flickered in the corner of the room. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw movement out of the corner of my eye. The paintings were changing. The faces in the portraits twisted, their expressions shifting from neutral to something darker, their eyes widening, mouths curling into sinister smiles. And then, in one horrifying instant, I realized they were watching me. Panicked, I stumbled backward, bumping into the table. My flashlight fell from my hand, rolling across the floor and casting eerie shadows around the room. Desperately, I scrambled to pick it up, my hands shaking. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, echoing off the walls. I ran up the stairs, not daring to look back. I could feel something behind me, a presence close on my heels, like it was reaching out, trying to pull me back down. I pushed the hidden door shut behind me and bolted it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still hear the whispers, muffled now but relentless, echoing through the wall. The rest of that night I stayed as far from that part of the library as I could. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. Who would believe me? A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up old records of the library and its history. I found an old newspaper article about a woman who had gone missing from that library almost 70 years ago. She had been a librarian, working late one winter night, and was never seen again. Her name was the same as mine. From that day on, I could feel something had changed. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of shadows in my peripheral vision, or hear faint whispers late at night, calling my name. I tried to forget about it, to convince myself it was all just a figment of my imagination. But one evening, as I was closing up alone, I heard it again, the same whisper from the hidden room, soft and inviting. Come closer. I left the library that night, never to return. But even now, sometimes in the quiet of the night, I hear that whisper calling, drawing me back to the place I promised I would never go again. Enjoying the story? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more creepy tales. It was the night before Halloween when my friends and I decided to visit the old house at the edge of town. Everyone in the neighborhood had heard the stories, of course. Stories of strange noises in the dead of night, of lights flickering in windows that no one ever entered. The house had been abandoned for years, and yet it remained standing, looming over the town like a forgotten relic of the past. The legends surrounding it were as old as the house itself. Some said it was haunted by the spirits of the original owners, who had disappeared mysteriously years ago. Others whispered that it was cursed, that anyone who set foot inside would never leave the same. Regardless of what people believed, the house was an enigma, one that we, as thrill-seeking teenagers, had to explore. "Tomorrow's Halloween," my friend Charlie said as we gathered at my house. "What better night to finally check it out?" I hesitated for a moment. I'd heard all the rumors, and a small part of me wondered if it was a bad idea, but the excitement of it all was too strong to ignore. "Are we really doing this?" I asked, glancing at the group of friends that had gathered around. There was Kate, our fearless leader, and Danny, the one always up for a challenge. They were both nodding eagerly. Charlie grinned. "We'll be in and out before midnight. No one will even know we were there." We decided to meet at midnight, the witching hour. When the clock struck 12, we made our way to the house under the cover of darkness. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of eerie stillness that only happens on Halloween night. A full moon hung in the sky, casting long shadows on the overgrown path leading to the house. The house stood before us, shrouded in an eerie mist. Its windows were boarded up, and the door, an old, heavy thing with a tarnished brass handle, was slightly ajar. As we walked toward it, a chill ran down my spine. The house seemed to watch us, the dark silhouette of its roof and broken windows like empty eyes staring into our souls. Charlie reached for the door and pushed it open. The hinges creaked, and the door groaned as if it hadn't been touched in decades. We stepped inside, our footsteps echoing in the silent hall. The air inside was damp, stale, and cold. The house smelled of mildew and dust, a smell that made me gag. Kate led the way, flashlight in hand, her beam slicing through the darkness. "Let's go up to the second floor," she suggested. "That's where the weird noises are supposed to come from." We followed her up the stairs, each step creaking under our weight. As we reached the top, I noticed that the hallway was lined with old, decaying portraits of long-dead relatives. Their eyes seemed to follow us, their expressions frozen in time, giving the place an unsettling feeling. We moved past them quickly, trying not to think about the eerie atmosphere. Then we heard it, a soft, dragging sound, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It seemed to be coming from the room at the end of the hallway. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. The others heard it too, and we all stopped in our tracks, staring at the darkened doorway. "What the hell is that?" Danny whispered, his voice shaking. Kate turned to us, her face pale. "I don't know, but we should check it out." Despite my growing sense of dread, I found myself following her again, my legs feeling heavy. The closer we got to the room, the louder the dragging sound became, until it was as if something, or someone, was slowly scraping its way across the floor. We reached the door, and Kate hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The room beyond was pitch dark, but the faint glow from her flashlight revealed a long, dusty rug that seemed to be moving. The sound grew louder, and I could see it now, the rug slowly shifting,
as though something was dragging itself beneath it. "Is there someone in there?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My pulse raced, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around and run. "I don't think so," Kate replied, but her voice cracked as she spoke. "I'm going in." Before any of us could stop her, she stepped into the room. The moment she did, the dragging sound stopped, and the room fell completely silent. Then, something even worse happened.
The door slammed shut behind her. We screamed, rushing toward the door, pounding on it, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew cold, and I could hear Kate's frantic breathing on the other side, but she couldn't open the door. "Kate!" Danny screamed. "Kate, are you okay?" There was no answer. Panic began to set in. We tried everything to open the door, but nothing worked. My mind raced. What was going on? Where had Kate gone? We had to get out of there. We had to leave before whatever had taken her got to us too. Suddenly we heard it. A voice. Faint at first, but growing louder. It was Kate, but it didn't sound like her. Her voice was distorted, as if someone, or something, was mocking her. "Get out," the voice croaked. "Get out while you still can." The door rattled again, and then, in one terrifying moment, it flung open. But there was nothing inside. No Kate, just darkness. We bolted from the house without another word, running down the stairs and out the front door, the night air biting at our skin. We didn't stop until we reached the car, and even then, we didn't feel safe. The house, that place, it was still with us, lingering like a shadow, waiting for us to come back. The next morning we went back to the house in daylight, hoping to find Kate, hoping everything had been a bad dream. But there was no sign of her. The house was just as empty as before, no dragging noises, no mysterious voices, just silence. We never spoke of that night again, but I knew something had changed in all of us. The house had taken something that would never return, and whatever was left behind was not human. To this day, I wonder what happened to Kate, and I wonder if the house is still out there, waiting for its next victims to dare to enter its cursed halls on Halloween night. It was supposed to be a simple road trip with my closest friends, a weekend away from the stress of work, an escape to the coast to explore new places and make memories. We had planned to visit a remote town near the edge of the cliffs, where an old, abandoned lighthouse stood, an eerie landmark known for its history and mystery. We arrived late in the evening, the sun already dipping below the horizon. The town was quiet, eerily so, as if it had been forgotten by time itself. As we drove down the winding roads, we could see the lighthouse in the distance, towering against the dark sky. It looked like something out of a horror film, its structure crumbling, windows boarded up, and an unsettling atmosphere surrounding it. We parked the car near the foot of the hill that led up to the lighthouse. The air was thick with fog, and the sound of the ocean crashing against the rocks below echoed in the distance. It was beautiful, but there was a strange feeling that lingered in the air, one that I couldn't shake off. "We have to check it out," my friend Ben said, his voice filled with excitement. Ben was always the adventurous one, the one who was never afraid to push boundaries. The rest of us hesitated, but Ben had already started climbing the hill toward the lighthouse. "I'll go with you," I said, trying to hide the unease in my voice. I wasn't sure if I wanted to explore the lighthouse, but something about it was calling me. Against my better judgment, the others followed. The closer we got to the lighthouse, the more oppressive the air seemed. It felt as though the building was alive, breathing with an energy that made my skin crawl. The fog around it thickened, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees. We reached the base of the lighthouse, its door half open, as though inviting us in. Ben grinned and pushed the door open, revealing a dark, damp interior. The scent of salt and mildew hung in the air, and I could hear the faint sound of something scraping against the floor above us. "Let's go up," Ben said, already making his way toward the spiral staircase. We followed, our footsteps echoing in the silence. As we climbed higher, the stairs creaked under our weight. and I began to feel more and more uneasy. There was a heavy silence inside the lighthouse, broken only by the sound of our breathing. When we reached the top, we stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the ocean. The view was breathtaking, the vast expanse of the sea stretching out beneath the pale light of the moon. But something about it felt wrong. The lighthouse, which had once served as a beacon for sailors, now stood abandoned, its light long extinguished. I leaned against the railing, staring out into the darkness when I noticed something odd. There, on the edge of the cliff far below, I saw a figure standing, staring back at me. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I squinted I could see it more clearly. A tall, dark figure, unmoving, standing just out of reach of the crashing waves. "Ben," I whispered, but when I turned to look at him, he was no longer beside me. The others were gone too. I froze, panic rising in my chest. Had they gone back down? Or had they... I didn't dare finish the thought. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from inside the lighthouse, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from the staircase. My heart raced and I turned toward the entrance, expecting to see one of my friends coming back up, but no one appeared. I hurried down the stairs, my pulse pounding in my ears, and as I reached the bottom, I found the door wide open, swinging gently in the wind. The air outside was colder now, and the fog had thickened, making it hard to see anything beyond a few feet. I called out, "Ben? Sarah? Anyone?" There was no answer. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a strange compulsion to leave, to get away from this place. But as I turned to leave, I heard a whisper, a low, almost inaudible voice coming from behind me. It was too soft to make out, but I could tell it was calling my name. I spun around, but the lighthouse was empty. The fog outside seemed to have swallowed everything, leaving only the eerie silence behind. I ran, heart pounding, back down the hill toward the car. As I approached, I saw the others, Ben, Sarah, and the rest, sitting in the car, staring out at the lighthouse, their faces pale and wide-eyed. They hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, as if they were waiting for something. "What's going on?" I asked, panting for breath. "Why didn't you follow me?" Ben didn't respond. He simply stared ahead, his eyes glassy, like he wasn't seeing me at all. I looked at Sarah, but her face was just as blank. "We need to go," I said urgently. And without waiting for a reply, I jumped into the driver's seat and started the car. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. No one said a word as I sped away from the lighthouse, the fog swirling around us like a curtain, hiding everything behind it. As we drove back through the winding roads, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something moving in the distance. Just a flicker of movement. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. We didn't speak much for the rest of the night, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The images of the lighthouse and the figure on the cliff haunted me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. A few weeks later, I tried to look up more about the lighthouse, hoping to understand what we had experienced that night. But when I searched for it online, I found nothing. No records, no history, no news stories. It was as if the lighthouse had never existed at all. The only trace of it was the faint, eerie memory of that night, and the feeling that whatever had been watching us on that cliff was still out there, waiting for someone else to stumble upon its forgotten ruin. To this day, I still have no idea what we encountered that night. Was it just our imagination? Or was there something more sinister lurking in that abandoned lighthouse? Whatever it was, it has stayed with me, a haunting memory that refuses to fade. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just a short break from the hustle and bustle of city life, an opportunity to unwind and escape to the mountains for a few days of peace. My friends and I had rented a cabin in a remote area, nestled deep in the woods, far away from any civilization. No phones, no internet, just nature and quiet nights under the stars. Little did I know, we were about to step into something that none of us would ever forget. The drive to the cabin was long, taking us through winding roads and dense forests, but we finally arrived as the sun began to set. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by towering trees, their branches swaying with the evening breeze. It looked exactly like the kind of place where you'd expect to hear stories about ghosts or strange occurrences. We unloaded our bags and settled in for the night. The cabin was cozy enough, with a large stone fireplace, rustic wooden furniture, and big windows that looked out into the forest. Everything seemed fine, peaceful even, but there was an odd feeling that lingered in the air. It wasn't anything we could put our finger on, just a subtle sense of unease. The first night we stayed up late around the fire, telling stories and drinking, enjoying the serenity of the woods. As the night grew darker, we heard strange sounds coming from the forest, branches snapping, the faint rustle of leaves, but we shrugged it off as normal animal noises. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. My friend Sarah and I went to the room we were sharing while the others stayed downstairs. I pulled the heavy curtains shut and got into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The air outside was still, but there was a strange energy that kept me wide awake. Suddenly I heard it, a soft, flickering light coming from outside. At first I thought it was a car's headlights, but we were miles away from the nearest road. The light seemed to move, like it was floating between the trees, bouncing and swaying in the distance. It was faint at first, but it grew brighter the longer I stared. I nudged Sarah, waking her up, but when she looked out the window, the light was gone. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't know," I said, pulling back from the window. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the eyes, maybe a firefly or some other natural phenomenon. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, we woke up to a sunny, clear day. The light from last night was quickly forgotten, overshadowed by the excitement of exploring the woods around the cabin. We grabbed some snacks, packed a few drinks, and set off into the forest for a hike. The trees here were thick, their branches reaching toward each other, creating a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The path was narrow, and it seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make much sense. After a while, we found ourselves in a clearing with a small, overgrown stream running through it. We stopped to rest, joking around and taking pictures, but as we sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. It was a fleeting moment, but it made my skin crawl. I brushed it off as paranoia and tried to enjoy the hike, but the unease remained. As the afternoon wore on, we decided to head back to the cabin. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, and the forest seemed to grow darker by the minute. That's when we saw it again, the light. This time, it was brighter, more distinct. It flickered in the distance between the trees, but it was moving toward us. "What the hell is that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. We all stared in silence, watching as the light came closer, floating unnaturally above the ground. It wasn't a flashlight or a lantern. It was something else, something we couldn't explain. Without thinking, we started walking toward it, curiosity getting the best of us. The closer we got, the brighter it became, until it was blinding. But as we reached the edge of the woods, the light disappeared. We stopped in our tracks, eyes wide with confusion. There was nothing there, just trees, shadows, and the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. "We need to get back to the cabin," I said, my voice tight with anxiety. The others didn't argue. We turned around and hurried back, the hairs on the back of our necks standing up as we walked faster. When we reached the cabin, we locked the door and closed all the windows, as though that would somehow protect us. But even inside, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. We sat in the living room, the silence pressing down on us, and tried to distract ourselves with games and music. But the light came again. It started with the same flickering glow, visible from the window. This time it was closer, much closer, and it wasn't moving in the way a natural light would. It hovered in one spot, pulsing, as if it was aware of us watching. We didn't speak. We just stared at it, mesmerized and terrified at the same time. Suddenly the door creaked open. None of us had moved, and no one had touched it. It was as if the door was opening on its own. I felt a chill run through me. The light outside grew brighter, and then, as if on cue, the room went cold. Our breath came out in visible clouds. I looked over at Sarah, who was trembling, her face pale. "I think we need to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But before we could even make a move, the light was gone. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud, and the room returned to its normal temperature. We all stared at each other, the silence almost unbearable. That night, we didn't sleep. We stayed awake in the living room, keeping the lights on and the door locked. But no matter how hard we tried to ignore it, we knew something wasn't right. The next morning, we packed up and left as quickly as we could. We didn't talk about the events of the night, but we all knew we had experienced something unexplainable. When we reached the nearest town and stopped for gas, I asked the attendant about the area. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "You didn't stay at that cabin, did you?" he asked, his voice low. "We did," I said, confused. "What's wrong with it?" The man shook his head, his face grim. "People have gone missing in those woods. Not everyone comes back." I didn't need to ask more. I just got in the car and we drove out of there, never to return. It was supposed to be a quick business trip, just a couple of days away to attend a conference in a small town. I was used to the usual hotel stays, nothing fancy, just a place to sleep and eat before heading back home. But that night, something happened that would change everything. The hotel I checked into was a small, older building, a little run down but still decent. It had an old-world charm to it, with its thick carpets and antique furniture that creaked as you walked by. The receptionist was a woman with dark, tired eyes, but she greeted me with a polite smile. "Room 304, she said, handing me the key. The elevator creaked as it took me up to the third floor. The moment the doors opened, I felt a chill. It was almost like stepping into a different time. The hallway was dark, and the only light came from a flickering bulb at the end of the hall. The air smelled stale, and the old carpets muffled the sound of my footsteps. I reached my room and slipped the key into the lock. The door opened with a slight groan, revealing a modest space. The bed was neatly made, but the room felt off. The wallpaper was peeling at the edges, and the furniture was a little too old-fashioned for my taste. But it was fine, I told myself. I was just here to sleep. As I settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the eerie quiet of the place. But every time I looked in the mirror, I felt as though something was watching me. I turned away quickly, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at me. The night passed uneventfully, but I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the old pipes in the building, but then I heard it again. A soft, deliberate tapping, like fingernails against glass. I sat up, my heart pounding, straining to hear over the sound of my own breath. The tapping continued, but it didn't sound like it was coming from the window. It was coming from the door. Slowly, I got out of bed and tiptoed over to the door. I pressed my ear against it, but the tapping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. I hesitated, wondering if I should open the door, but I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I had heard enough ghost stories to know that this was the kind of thing that shouldn't be investigated. But then, I heard something even more unsettling, a whisper, soft and faint, as if it were right behind me. "Come out." I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, just the same as before. I rushed to the window and threw it open, desperate for fresh air to calm my racing heart. The night air was cool and still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I locked the window and pulled the curtain shut, then returned to bed, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, lying perfectly still, listening for any sign of movement. Morning came and I was exhausted but relieved that the strange events had stopped. I decided to go downstairs for breakfast, hoping to shake off the odd experience. As I walked through the hotel lobby, the receptionist gave me a strange look. Her smile was gone, replaced by a blank expression. "Room 304, you said?" she asked in a low voice, as if it were a question. I nodded. She hesitated before speaking again. "You know, we don't rent that room out often," she said softly, almost as if she were trying to warn me. "It's not a good room to stay in." I frowned, thinking she was just making small talk. "Why is that?" She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping even lower. "People have stayed there before, but none of them stayed for long. Something happens in that room." I laughed it off, thinking it was just a superstition or a local legend. "Right," I said with a smile, trying to lighten the mood. "I'll make sure I'm out by checkout time." But that night, things only got worse. Around midnight, I was awoken by the tapping again. It was louder this time, almost frantic. The whispering followed soon after, but this time the voice was clearer. "Open the door." I froze in bed, my breath caught in my throat. The tapping was coming from the door again, but this time it was accompanied by the sound of shuffling footsteps, slow and deliberate. With my heart racing, I reached for the phone by the bed, intending to call the front desk, but the phone was dead. I looked at the clock, 12:42 a.m. I had no choice but to confront whatever was going on. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking beneath me. I approached the door, pressing my ear against it again. The footsteps had stopped, but the whispering had grown louder. "Come out. Let us in." My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle. The moment I touched it, the door flew open on its own, almost as if something were pulling it. And there, standing in the hallway, was a figure. A man, tall and gaunt, with pale skin and hollow eyes. His clothes were old, tattered, and his hands were extended toward me, his fingers twitching as though he were beckoning me to come closer. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. "No!" I shouted. "Leave me alone!" But the figure didn't respond. It only stepped forward, slowly, relentlessly, until it was right in front of me. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Suddenly the lights flickered, and the man was gone. The hallway was empty. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was alone in the dark again. The next morning, I packed my bags and left as quickly as I could. I didn't care about my business meetings. I just needed to get away from that hotel. But as I was leaving, I saw the receptionist again. She looked at me with a knowing expression. "You shouldn't have stayed in room 304, she said, her voice soft but firm. I nodded, too shaken to speak, and walked out into the daylight, relieved to be away from the hotel and from whatever haunted that room. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. And when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw the faint outline of a figure standing in the back seat. I never spoke about room 304 again, but I couldn't forget the whisper, the tapping, or the man who had been waiting in the hallway. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. I hope you found some peace and comfort. Before you drift off completely, let me know in the comments what time it is where you are and which country you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. Until next time, rest well and sweet dreams.